episode. It was pretty much the introduction to this little program we're trying to put together, and it is about showing the plan that God has in the Bible for all humanity, from the original intended way of understanding it. And of course, we are focusing and highlighting mostly the Noahide laws. We've been watching and noticing
right.
that there are people who are beginning to see about, listen to and see these laws being spoken about and hearing. And so, some are doing injustice to them by the fact that they're speaking about them and not really knowing about them. And instead of actually seeking to know more about what they are and how they're supposed to be understood. Because in reality, regardless of religious mindset, these are laws that any one person can adapt into their lifestyle. And in just beginning that journey will transcend their knowledge to a different level when it comes to being a better human being. Regardless of where they reach on the levels of whether they want to accept that God exists or doesn't exist, or who God is for them or not, that eventually is something that they have to work out for themselves. The main point we're trying to show is, God does have a plan, and He didn't create haphazardly. He thought things through, if we may use, anthropomorphism as we speak. Y'all remember Jack? And welcome again.
Well, and two, we had noticed a lot of different takes on the Noahide laws, and sometimes you find, like on YouTube recently, we were looking at where somebody had done several little bits on the fact that these laws don't even exist. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense we're trying to put forth a defense of that. The last time that we got together, we talked about the fact that there was 2,448 years that actually transpires before we actually get the written text of the Torah. And so some people say, well, gee, we can't find these 7 listed as a list, as you find the 10 words, or commonly referred to by people as 10 commandments. But we're saying that man had always had this covenant relationship with God from the very beginning. And because he has a covenant relationship with God, then there's an expectation from God to man to live a certain lifestyle. So he wouldn't have left him without laws. We proved that from the very creation of man. Man had already given him laws. I mean, even what we find in the written text in Genesis, the book of Bereshit, that the thought of man being brought into the world, all of a sudden he has a dietary law. He's to eat, not to eat meat, by the way. He can only eat the seed-bearing green herbs, and he can only eat the fruit of the trees that has the seed within it. So there's a dietary restriction from the very beginning. Later on, when man is actually, the second part of the story, man is actually created. God tells us how he creates man. And he winds up putting him in the garden, and he gets similarly another prohibition: don't eat of that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So in some sense, man's always had this kind of covenant relationship with the Creator. Whether it was humanity at large, or whether it was a smaller group of humanity that we know as Israel, which also has this covenant relationship with God. But what we would like to do is take up a text that's not so well known and not spoken of, because somebody would say, well, gee, if these laws were there, then why doesn't somebody later on bring them up? Right. And so what we would like to do is take like I said, it's a text that's not so well known. It's in Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 5. And there's a lot of speculation, not to say a lot of speculation, but there's some speculation that this text actually is related to the covenant relationship that existed between Israel and the people of Israel and God. But the majority of the commentators, they say this text actually refers to the Noahidic covenant, which would involve all those laws up until that point in time. And men like Maudlin, for example, Arbanel, and many other commentators. And by the way, I even found there was a lot of Christian commentators. Can't remember right off the top of my head, but there were quite a few Christian commentators that actually says that this verse actually belongs to the covenant that existed from Adam up until Noah, and even from Noah on. But that's a little bit different story, because a lot of those people are what we call covenanters, and they see a covenant that existed with Adam, and then later on was reinforced with Noah, and eventually reinforced with the people of Israel. But what we would like to do is take this passage in Isaiah 24:5. We want to read it to you, and then we want to analyze what he says. So Hiram's going to do this honors of reading Isaiah chapter 24 and verse 5 for us.
The earth also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate.
That's good enough. The point of this text, by the way, the reason it seems to be more universal is because the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, it's not just the inhabitants of the land of Israel, but the inhabitants of the earth, Eretz, which could be earth, it could be just Israel itself, but the inhabitants, right? It's not one specific group of inhabitants. If we said, for example, that the Israelites had defiled the earth, okay, then we'd think this has more relationship to the covenant that existed between God and the people of Israel. But the inhabitants of the earth does this. But what we do see from Isaiah says that there's a threefold problem here, right? He says, again, if you read those three things that he says, that's okay, I got it marked there. And he gives three reasons.
The earth also is defiled,
Right.
under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws,
Right.
changed the ordinance,
Right.
broken the everlasting covenant.
Okay, so,
Written.
right, the brittle one. And when he says, by the way, that they have transgressed the law, it's not the Torah here, it's Torot, which generally we understand as teaching. If he had said Torah, then we would have been specifically talking about the first 5 books that contains the laws, ordinance, statutes, and so forth for the people of Israel. But in this sense, he's saying Torah, the teachings, right? So, that 2,448 years that we spoke about, pretty lengthy about, seems to be silent, but he isn't, because here he's telling us they violated the teachings. So what type of teachings did they violate? I mean, that's the real question, right? So what we would like to do at this time is do kind of a comparative analysis with what Isaiah is saying that occurred prior to the flood, and what actually transpired in the flood, pre-flood civilization. And so the first one he says that they just basically messed up the teachings, right? Well, what was the first teachings, right? So we want to talk about corruption on 3 different levels, because when we go back to the Genesis text and we start looking at the story there, God tells us at least 3 times the earth has corrupted itself, right?
Right. And it says the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence.
Right. So we have that idea.
And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt.
Right.
For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth.
Right.
And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence.
Exactly. And the interesting part about the word violence, by the way, in Hebrew, is the word Hamas, which has particular interest today of what's going on in the land of Israel. However, what we like to do is to look at these ideas that Isaiah is talking about. How do they corrupt the teachings? How do they violate the ordinance? And eventually, the complete downfall of society. So the very first thing we talk about is corruption of true ideas and true beliefs. Now there's a text. It's in Genesis, and
It's Brenda.
in Genesis chapter 4, and it talks about in the days of Enos. Now, in most translations that maybe you might be familiar with, especially for people that read the King James translation, for example. In the King James translation, it says in the days of Enosh, which was in the generations of Adam. In the days of Enosh, they begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Actually, it's a really poor translation, right? Because it actually says, in the days of Enosh, they begin to profane the name of the Lord. In other words, well, what does that mean? What does it actually mean when they profane the name of the Lord? It really means that nobody's calling upon the name. Nobody's actually doing that. They're not. They just quit. Okay, they quit calling upon the name. Now the question becomes, why did they quit calling upon the name? Okay. Now, what I would like to read to you, by the way, is the writings of the Rambam. His name is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and it's the Mishnah Torah, and it is Hilkot Avoda Zera. Okay, talking about the laws of idolatry. And in chapter 1, he takes up this discussion of what we just talked about in Genesis, right? So he says, during the times of Enosh, mankind made a great mistake. And the wise men, and I find this interesting, by the way, it's not the ignorant people
Right.
that make this mistake, it's the wise men, right? And he says, and the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel, and it says, Enosh himself was one of those who erred. Pretty interesting, right? And then he gives to tell us about their mistake was as follows. They said God created stars and spheres with which to control the world. He placed them on high and treated them with honor, making them servants who minister before him. Accordingly, now again, this is according to them, it is fitting to praise and glorify them and to treat them with honor. They, talking about these wise men, they perceive this to be the will of God. Blessed be he, that they magnify and honor those whom he magnified and honored, just as a king desires that the servants who stand before him be honored. Indeed, doing so is an expression of honor to the king. He goes on to say, after conceiving of this notion, they began to construct temples to the stars, offer sacrifice to them. They would praise and glorify them with words, prostrate themselves before them, because by doing so, they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. And I'd like to read just one more little section here, by the way. He said, this was the essence of the worship of false gods. This is where it began. This is how it began. And this was the rationale of those who worshiped them. They would not say that there is no other God except for this star. And he points to a passage in Jeremiah, by the way. In Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 7 through 8, he says, this message was conveyed by Jeremiah, who declared, who will fear you, O King of the nations, for you it is fitting among all the wise men of the nations. Notice that again, the wise men of the nations. In all their kingdom there is none like you. They have one foolish and senseless notion. They conceive of their empty teachings as wood. That is, all that know you, all know that you alone are God. Their foolish errors consist of conceiving this emptiness as your will. So even Jeremiah is saying that in his day they're still continuing this same false concept and false idea. I find that amazing. That it begins in the days of Enosh. It begins with the wise men. And Jeremiah is still saying it's still the wise men of the nation that's still perpetrating this false idea. And what happened was during that period of time that it was a complete breakdown of true ideas and true concepts of God. And so they violated what we refer to within the commandments of the 7 laws of Noah, the Sheva Mitzvot. It's a violation, number one, of idolatry. From the very get-go, right? There's just prohibition against worshiping anything other. And so in the days of Enosh, the wise men, not so wise, but they were supposedly the wisest men. Their great failure was, at least, is to compare the king of the universe in the same way as the king of a nation. That was their greatest mistake in how they did that comparison. But all of a sudden, they have these corrupt ideas about God, right? And then eventually, of course, as the idolatry progresses, some guy would stand up and say he's a prophet of one of those stars, and he would say, you need to do this to worship them, you need to do that to worship them. And then, of course, idolatry becomes more and more built upon, right? And all of a sudden, religions are based upon these idolatrous thoughts. And so Jeremiah points out to us, it's nothing new, right? The wise people of the nations are still doing the same thing.
Right.
It's not the fact that they don't say that there's really only one God, but then they fabricate all these other gods. And the interesting thing that Jeremiah brings up back in the same idea is that they understood this as being the will of God. That what they were doing was actually the will of God. That's what happened to the people in the days of Enosh. It's what was happening to the people in the days of Jeremiah. So we have a great similarity. But in doing so, they have violated the law of idolatry very clearly, right? But then they've also violated the law of blasphemy. Why? Because they've made God into something that he isn't. It's a very blasphemous idea to think that God wants us to do this or wants us to do that. It's the will of God that we should worship this star or worship something else. So that's the very first thing. And so when that Isaiah 24:5 passage, Isaiah makes it very clear that they had transgressed the Torah, the teachings, which would involve having really clear concepts of God and really clear ideas of God. Okay? So that's the very first issue. So all of a sudden, we begin to see the downfall of humanity very early in the days of Enosh. But a belief system, having proper ideas and correct belief system, by the way, is kind of an individual thing, So we hadn't really had the complete breakdown of society yet. But that's the beginning. And that's what Isaiah is saying. The inhabitants of the earth, why are they doing this? Well, what's happening to them is because, number one, they violate the law of idolatry and they violate the law of blasphemy. Okay? So let's take the second issue.
Corruption of the laws and robbing the rights of others.
Which he says that they've done what? According to Isaiah, they have changed what?
The teaching, the ordinances.
The ordinances, right? And ordinances at this point in time, he's talking about what? The laws, right? Now, when we start looking at the laws, for example, and I'll let you do this one, by the way, which has to do with that second corruption, right? So they're corrupting the laws, corrupting the ordinances, which means what? They're violating the laws, they're changing the laws, and of course we know why people want to change laws. It's because
they want them to reflect their will.
Exactly. They want them to do, in other words, God gives laws to control men's passions.
To curb them.
To curb them. Yeah. At least curb them. Well, we hope it changes them. Gives them a new direction. But at least when God gives laws, it curbs our passions. And so when these men were not going to allow their passions to be curbed, then what do? You make laws
that suit you.
That suit you. You know, I've often said, for people that simply get involved in religion, it's almost like going to Baskin Robbins, right? And most of y'all probably been to Baskin Robbins at one point in time. The Baskin Robbins, for those who don't have them, they're actually an ice cream shop. And they used to have this great selling factor was that they had 32 different flavors. 32 flavors of ice cream. And of course today they have not only 32 flavors of ice cream, but they also have yogurt flavors too, so there's probably a lot more than 32. But you can go to one of those shops and you can get a little taste from all 32 flavors before you actually choose which one you want. I mean, it's obviously you're probably not going to taste all 32, but if you went in there, you could actually go through the 32 flavors of ice cream and maybe even go through all the flavors of the yogurt, which you'd probably be full, not even wanting ice cream after that. But what happens is, you taste all those and you think, okay, well, I want a cone of this one. This is the one I prefer. And that's kind of the way it is with people choosing religion. They choose one that fits them, that tastes good to them, that fits their lifestyle. It's not about facing responsibility. It's not about curbing one's passions or emotions.
It's more like feeding them.
Exactly. So, and that's why sometimes I refer to people's religious choices as going to Baskin Robbins. The reality is God gives laws for us as human beings to recognize, number one, responsibility. We are responsible for our behaviors, which kind of weighs pretty heavy on us if we ever come to grips with that. Okay, we're responsible for what we do. Nobody else is. And then secondly, it's up to us to make our lifestyles fit with the laws of God rather than changing or altering those laws that will allow our passions and our emotions to rule us. Right? So in this case, by the way, we run into that second one, and all of a sudden we see in the text of Genesis, we have a story about supposedly these B'nai Elohim, which some people will translate, most translations will translate as sons of God, but it could also be translated just as well as sons of the judges or the sons of the rulers or the sons of the powerful. It might be referring back to those wise men that we were talking about.
Well, later on in that same text it says, and these were the men of renown.
Exactly.
Those
exactly.
would have been the wise men.
Yeah, they would have been the wise men, and maybe the generations that proceeded from them. But we find something now about these men that's very interesting. When we start talking about they're violating, they're corrupting something. They're corrupting the ordinances. In other words, humanity should have laws that bring about justice, right?
Well, that's the point. If you're robbing the rights of others, how just is that?
Exactly. And the whole point is, in the 7 laws, we actually say there's a positive one that says, there's this admonition to set courts of justice, but it actually stems from a negative. And the negative is not to do any injustice.
Right.
And so any law that we establish should be to order justice, not and to do away with injustice.
But it also defines what injustice is.
Exactly.
So that you can do the opposite. Oppression.
Exactly.
Abuse.
Abuse, oppression.
Whether it be physical, mental, emotional, whatever. But it always points to the widows, to the orphans not being taken care of.
And that's because, by the way, they can't speak for themselves. They're in a weakened position. And it also, by the way, in the Torah brings up the idea not only about oppressing the widows and the orphans, but even the stranger. Because if you happen to be in a strange country, basically means, okay, I'm here illegally in some way. and I don't really have any rights. And so it's almost like you got to have somebody that will speak up for them. They can't do it on themselves because they really don't have a right to. So the Torah forbids oppression of strangers. But it's talking about people being in a weakened position that cannot speak out for themselves. And so within the laws of B'nai Noah, the Sheva Mitzvot, there is this concept of a prohibition against injustice. So we understand that as a admonition to set up courts of justice to ensure, by the way, that everyone receives justice. You know, not the rule of law, but justice. And what happens is, in America and a lot of other countries, it's not necessarily justice that prevails, it's the rule of law that prevails.
Right.
Right? So what happens, rather than actually instituting courts of justice,
They're the opposite.
they're doing the opposite. They're actually going by the rule of law. Okay, they made laws. The question becomes, are they just laws? Okay? And the reason we say they're not just laws, immediately we are told that these powerful men, probably in positions of making law, one of the things that we were told is immediately that they are taking wives. You know? Now, it could mean one of two things. It could mean that this is a way that men acquired wives back in this way. They just took wives. But that seems kind of barbaric. You know, you kind of get the idea of the prehistoric age men running another club, you know, clubbing women in the head and taking wives. But it also might have a connotation that they pass laws, right? Because they have this strong sexual drive, you know, that's not being controlled, not being regulated, that they're taking other men's wives, right? So all of a sudden, we find out maybe, based on the text in Isaiah, couple that with the text in Genesis, they're talking about the same two ideas. All of a sudden, we see the corruption of these ordinances, right? And this violation of courts of justice, or just preventing injustice, is really what we should think about. So here we have a situation where they're actually using law to oppress people and to take what they want, you know, to ensure laws. It's almost like the same thing, by the way, that happened later on in Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And Abraham brings up the point where the just judge of the whole world judge unjustly, because he knows that God's just. But he knows that what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, that they have laws, right? But what kind of laws were there?
They served their purpose.
They served their purpose, and their purpose was to ensure that nobody else came into that part of the world. And if they did, even their laws allowed them to rob them without ever being punished for it. It's an amazing story. And the other side of the coin is that a lot of people go through and they say, oh, you know, well, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because they're immoral, you know, homosexuals, you know, all this different type of ideology to think about. But Ezekiel the prophet brings up the point of why Sodom and Gomorrah is actually destroyed and punished by God. And it says that they had plenty of bread, right? In fact, they had plenty of everything. You know, this was a wealthy neighborhood, but he says they were not charitable. They were not kind people. They were not compassionate people, and that's ultimately why they were destroyed. Okay? So, if we look at what Isaiah is telling us, looking back into the text of Genesis, we see the violation of the prohibition against idolatry. We see the violation against the prohibition of blasphemy. Now, in the second corruption, we see the violation against the institution of courts of justice, really having really just laws. And all of a sudden, we've got three violations here, right? And the third thing Isaiah brings up is Isaiah 24:5. He says there's another type of corruption.
Yeah.
This is very interesting too, by the way.
Broken the everlasting covenant.
Broken the everlasting covenant, because, and he's talking about, when he says everlasting covenant, it's called the Brit Olam, the everlasting covenant. Now, you have to take this based on the text. When he says he's broken the everlasting covenant, when you go back to the Genesis text, the text that you read to us earlier, all of a sudden, God informs us something. He makes an interesting comparison about corruption, right? The corruption of man is being of flesh, man. But he makes a comparison with earth. Why does he do that?
Yeah, for the earth is filled with violence.
Yeah, the earth's filled with violence, but all flesh is corrupt.
Through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth.
Right. And all of a sudden, wait a minute. The earth's corrupt? How did it get corrupt?
What is it that they could have done to make the earth be corrupt?
Yeah, and the other point is, why does he even allude to the fact, why does he bring in the idea of flesh being corrupted with that of the earth being corrupted? That's really the question. There are what we call social natural norms, right? Now, the social natural norms is what keeps societies going on. Under the categories of the 7 laws, these natural norms, by the way, would be things that every society, by using their own sense of rational reasoning, would eventually come to maintain a healthy society. In other words, they would come up with the idea we shouldn't be killing each other, right? We shouldn't be stealing from each other. Neither should we be involved in adultery, any kind of illicit type sex. But primarily we just choose the word adultery, taking another man's wife. Those are kind of social norms, natural norms. And these would be the norms that even ancient kind of pre-mortal societies would have come up with on their own if they were going to exist as a people. You can't have a great city with people killing each other, because eventually, number one, people are going to leave the city, or number two, you're not going to have a city.
Well, it's again the point of these being the minimal requirement to merit life.
Exactly.
Based on the judgment of God.
Right.
Our actions of breaking these laws in a societal point of view, from a society point of view, is the factor is that you break them and it ruins the society machine.
Exactly.
One cog of the machine messes up, and then the other cog does it too, and then the other one does it, and then before you know it, you have a broke down machine. So again, it's just not just society, but the whole universe seems to work under laws.
Exactly.
So what makes anyone think that our part of this universe shouldn't?
Exactly.
And if there is a law, is it what law is better? The one that's man given, or the one that's God given, or creator given, however you want to put it?
Right.
The point is that this text shows us that we do have a certain way to live by it, and all it takes is one to sit down and read it and study it, and it will give you that merit for life based on these, because it's like you said, it's not belief or whatever. That's our own individual personal journey, whereas the way we behave happens to be that part of society that's mandatory in order for society to exist.
Right. And in some sense, by the way, from the creation of Adam until now, man has always stood in a covenant relationship with God. And that covenant relationship means the Creator says, I want you to do something. I want you to live a certain life. And man lives that life. And so if we have this covenant relationship, which we do, and then again, even after the flood, that covenant is revamped, not in the sense of the laws being revamped, but reestablished with mankind. Because at one point, as he says, they've broken the everlasting covenant. So the covenant has to be reinforced once again with humanity after the flood. which we call that, the covenant that God makes with Noah, the Noahide covenant. But man's always had this covenant identity with God from the very beginning, with Adam all the way up through to where we're sitting at today. Man still stands in covenant relationship with God. And because we do, the Creator has the right to demand that we live a certain way. And He's going to tell us what that way is. So even though we can't go to the written text of the Torah, we can't just go there and say, okay, here's the list of the 7. But what we can do, based on this little unknown passage from Isaiah 24:5, what we can do, we can go back and we can say, okay, it is for sure that Isaiah the prophet knew about these, right? Why? Because he tells us they violate them. And what happens again is in the Genesis passages, it doesn't give us a list of them, but it gives us a list of the violations, right? So in the days of Enosh, they violated an individual beliefs, right? In other words, all of a sudden this individual belief about having true beliefs and true concepts of God, which is kind of an individual thing, and we see Noah still maintained those while the rest of the society had left him. It began the days of Enosh. It began with the wise men too, by the way. And then we find out in the days prior to the flood that we have these great men that's supposed to have been the judges, the rulers, the powerful, the elite, the wise, if you want to call them that. They should have been instituting laws that really brought about justice and curbed man's passion, as God had given the ability to do that, because they're to establish courts of justice, which means you establish laws that actually ensure that everybody gets justice. Rather than doing that, they actually establish laws that make it more beneficial for them to get what they want. It doesn't curb their passion, it doesn't curb their desires, and actually allows their desires and their passions to be fulfilled any way they want. So we see that in the fact that they took for themselves wives. They're just whatever passions drive them, whatever they want. And they'll make a law that says it's okay for them to do that. And so he brings up, they broke the ordinance, right? And then that third thing that Isaiah brings up, which is as we say, the straw that broke the camel's back, individual beliefs and, the injustice, but it's the social norms, right? Murder, theft, adultery, promiscuous sexual activity. And the reason, by the way, we want to get back to this, the reason we say that he, in the passage in Genesis, talks about these 3 corruptions, and the final one, he makes the analogy of the earth, as you spoke about. The earth has natural laws that govern it. And that's why he brings up the fact that this final corruption falls in the same category. These natural laws that men, that all civilizations eventually would have come to on their own, such as don't kill each other, especially murder, don't murder each other, and don't steal from each other, and don't take somebody's wife, don't commit adultery, because that will just rip society apart. You cannot establish society without those 3 bottom principles being in existence in some form or some fashion. And we see this, by the way, in different civilizations, that they've always understood this. Yeah, they might not get the God thing right.
I was going to say something about that if you'll give me a second. Yeah. I find it very interesting that even though the ultimate goal is the recognition of God, when he judged man at the time of the flood, according to the text, that's not even why, in essence...
No, if he'd done that, he'd died in the days of Enosh.
Yeah, it was not necessarily a need for him to say, look at me. It was more so, how dare you not to live, in what I've given you.
Exactly.
So it's interesting because everybody has this idea. A lot of people have this idea that, well, the ultimate goal is to know God. Yes, I understand that, and I agree with that. But what happens to the person who chooses not to necessarily accept that God exists and all this stuff, but they want to live a good life. How can they live a good life? Well, that's the interesting about the 7 laws, is that the 7 laws has both the spiritual and that which is physical. The physical part is for those individuals who see a benefit in following these laws for the sake of humanity living a survival life. They can do that, and your hope is that they will also reach to the higher level of the understanding of Allah, which is that which is the spiritual side, which recognizes God and He's the Creator and He's the one that's given us this. So it's not like it's looking down at man for not recognizing that, but for the sake of violating the least amount of respect that they should have for that which was given to them.
Well, and again, that's back to this idea that Jeremiah presents, by the way, in that passage that we read from the Mishnah Torah. In chapter 10, verse 7 through 8, he says, "Who will not fear you, kings of the nations?" Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a real question. Who will not fear you, kings of the nations? Right? King of the nations. He's talking about Hashem, right? Mm-hmm. Who will not fear you, king of the nations? For to you it is fitting, right? In other words, this is fitting for everyone to fear you. But he says, among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like you. Okay? But here's the problem. They have one foolish, he's talking about the wise men among the nations. They have one foolish and senseless notion. They conceive of their empty teachings as wood. Now, what does that mean? So he says, that is, all know that you alone are God, but their foolish error consists of conceiving of this emptiness as your will. In other words, they might have, at least in their mindset is, they might have all these different gods, right? And the real emptiness of all this is, they conceive of this fact that this is really the will of God for them to worship God this way. That's the real emptiness of it. So the reality is, can a Christian keep the 7 laws? Can a Muslim keep the 7 laws? I think even Buddhists and Hindu and anyone can. Absolutely. Do they have the correct concept and ideas of God? Maybe, maybe not.
That's between them and God.
That's between them and God. And that's why God didn't destroy the world in the days of Enoch, because that's an individual thing. But it's the laws that break down the natural course of society. Mm-hmm. That's the ones eventually that God says, okay, that's it.
Yeah, it's like saying, I don't care.
Exactly.
So if I don't care, you don't care?
Then
here's the output.
Well, I had and I used this last one to kind of sign off. I guess that we probably went on long enough about this. But here's the reality. The reality is these people, they violate all the 7 laws. It's very clear. Isaiah points that out in Isaiah 24:5 by making those 3 assumptions, which correlate, by the way, back to the book of Genesis. We pointed that out. And I always remember I'd gone to a birthday celebration of an older gentleman years and years ago in New York. His name was David Horowitz. And David was giving this great speech. And for his, I think it was his 90th birthday, And the one thing that always has stuck with me over the years that he says, and I think this probably would stick with anybody based on the context in which you hear it, at least when I heard it, but he says this. He says, if you don't give a damn, God doesn't give a damn. Now that's always stuck with me. Right? And that's really the bottom line in some sense. But the bottom line is that if we can't have these very bare minimum natural social norms as the prohibition against murder and the prohibition against theft and the prohibition against adultery or illicit sex, if we don't have those basic norms, then society's done away with. If, for example, we said that in the days of Enos, they didn't have the right, they strayed away from the right ideas about God. In other words, they didn't have it right. You know, they wasn't calling on the name of Hashem anymore. They were calling on these maybe different types of gods that they had fabricated or they had made. Or they had made go-betweens, you know, between him and them. And they wasn't going directly to him anymore. They failed to do that, in other words. But God didn't say, I'm going to destroy you because you don't have the true idea of me, right? Even when they begin to distort justice and make laws that agreed with their appetites and passions, he didn't destroy them then. But that last corruption, that lawlessness that filled the earth, violence, Hamas, that's when God says, okay, that's it. These people cannot be saved. They have gone beyond the limits. They can't be brought back. And then thank God, by the way, that our society has not gone since that point in time. They might have been maybe some of these laws have been violated for sure. But the basic natural social norms that can be brought out through natural reasoning. I mean, these are laws that we're told that men would have come to on their own, even if the Torah hadn't been given, right? In other words, they're rational, they're logical laws that allow a society to actually live together. You know.
Well, that's proven too because the ancient law books that were found.
Sure, ancient codes. Hammurabi Code, for example, is one of the
exactly. That proves that there has always been a knowledge of proper behavior.
Exactly.
And this is the point that I think the Torah is trying to
if you're going to have a society, if you're going to build, if you're just going to go out there and live on your own, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to have societies with cities, you've got to have those social norms, or something it's not going to work out.
Right.
Those codes, those earlier codes, are not exactly. Some of them were pretty good codes, by the way. But
it was still the social norms that man should have come to.
Exactly.
And that's what I think that's part of the message in the text as well.
Yes.
And I think the Torah actually is corroborated when you look at ancient history, because it's given a detail of, well, if this happens according to what the Torah says, there should be a trace of it somewhere out there.
Absolutely.
On somebody else's point of view.
Absolutely.
And it happens to be the case when you look at the fact of what you find in those ancient, books or copies and codes. They had laws. They knew that that's the only way you can maintain society. But people get caught up in their own desires.
Mm-hmm.
People get caught up in just doing what they want, power hungry, and they start messing everything up. We're sadly seeing some of that today.
Exactly. Well, even dictators have laws.
Yeah.
But are they just laws?
That's the problem.
And a dictator can go out and take any man's life that he wants to. That's his own law. I mean, he becomes his own law, and that's not the way it works. God, the Creator, like I said, man in some sense has always been, ever since he's been in existence on the face of the earth, has had a covenant relationship with God, and that means that the Creator tells the creations how he wants them to live. What's necessary for them to live. But let me add one more thing. These laws that we talk about, some people say, oh, law, it's horrible, it's awful, You say that until you need them. Everybody does. But the problem is, if you have a Creator that is a compassionate, kind, yes, also just, and also righteous, right? All those things that we think about. If he's all those in one, and he is, an absolute unity of one, he's not divided up into kindness, and he's not divided up in this,
Right.
If we have that, then any law that he gives us is for our benefit, right? because it doesn't benefit him in any sense.
Right.
You know, some people have this idea of, well, if I keep all these laws, I really please God. I can't please God because God can't be changed in one way or the other. In other words, if I can please Him, then I can make Him sad, or I can make Him angry, I can make Him happy. You know, in Malachi, he makes a statement. He says, "I am the Lord God; I change not." So all the laws, you know, whatever form that you want to look at them on, they were given for me and you, for our benefit, right? And not for mine, your benefit, but for, if I live a righteous life, according to Job, by the way, Job says, if I live a righteous life, who does it affect? It affects me, you, right? And the people around me. On the other hand, if I live an evil, wicked life, you know, who does it affect? Me and you, the people around me. In other words, I'm not creating any change in God. I'm not making Him happy. I'm not making Him sad. I'm not saying that to please Him. The Creator gave us laws to benefit us, for us to live by them, for us to understand how these laws work in our social environment that creates a healthy place where we as individuals can really get true concepts of God and for the first time really worship God the way we're supposed to.
Right.
But you have to create that healthy environment in order to do that. If those social norms don't exist, there's no healthy environment. And nobody's working for the betterment of the other individual, right? So when I keep a law, I realize it's not just beneficial to me, it's beneficial to everyone around me. And you can make this in just an everyday example. You know, we have laws in America. If you're driving an automobile, when you come to a traffic light and the traffic light turns red, you stop. That's the law. You know.
Whose benefit is that for?
Whose benefit? For me and for the other guy that gets the green light to go the other way.
Exactly.
Right? It's for my benefit and it's for the other guy's benefit. I've often said, by the way, you know, if you look at the manual, the driving manual, it tells you that you should stop when you come to a red light. One thing it doesn't tell you when it turns green, it doesn't say you have to go, right? It would say proceed with caution. Why? Because somebody might be violating the law. In other words, they might not see the law as something that's beneficial to them, and if they run that, and if you don't proceed with caution, even when it turns green, you can still be harmed by somebody that's violating the law. So we have to be careful in our society. But the point of the law is that if I obey it, I'm not going to get harmed, and the other individual's not going to get harmed, right? And that's the point when God gives the law to humanity. And of course, the laws have a little bit more to point us toward Him and about our worship and about our individual perfection, which is a different story. That's kind of a moral issue more than it is a law issue. We have to deal with that in a different way as far as being something about the person, you know, the perfection of the individual. It's kind of more of a moral issue than it is necessarily a law issue.
Well, you work at both.
Yeah, you work at both simultaneously.
That's the interesting thing.
But you have to understand what the outworking of the law is.
The law of God is one that you work with both.
Yes.
Because that, as you work with one, you perfect the other, and as you work with the other, you perfect the one.
Right.
So, again, it's a hand-in-hand thing.
Exactly.
But yeah, I am very excited about this. This is getting us forward a lot.
Yeah. So that's our thoughts from Isaiah 24 and verse 5, coupled with the passages in Genesis 6 and 11 through 13. And we've shared what our thoughts are on these, along with other men's thoughts, by the way. And so you can go back, you can look at these texts and see for yourself that these laws are there. And the reason that humanity is finally destroyed with a flood is because that these laws, these basic 7, eventually were all broken. Were they broken all laws simultaneously? No. It was a progression. Progression from having true ideas and true concepts of God, that went away. That was one of the first things that evaded them. They quit calling upon the name of Hashem. They're calling upon all these other different gods. That's what it means when they begin to profane the name. And then the violation of just making sure that you have a just society where people are not oppressed, where laws are made to ensure that each individual receives justice. And what happened was, seemingly there were some powerful men that got into rule that wanted their way to get their to have their gratification of their own passions and their own desires, and so they made laws that would certainly grant them that. And then lastly was the violation of the natural laws of humanity, of the prohibition against murder and prohibition against theft and the prohibition against Buddha's saying adultery, it's any kind of perverse sex. And finally God says, okay, that's it. The norms have broken down, the natural norms have broken down, and never going to be reclaimed by this society. They're never going to make it back. And so that's it, right? And all flesh has become corrupt, and he makes that that same idea, connects it back with the corruption of the earth. Natural norms have been corrupted.
Well, thank you for spending some more time, and thank you guys for watching, if you're still sticking around, and hopefully we'll have you back, with some of the other topics that we're going to bring up, and just remember, anything you do every day, consciously think if what you're doing is only a benefit to you, or is it also benefiting the guy next door, the person next to you, in the line or whatever. That is basically one of the levels that is being taught in the text, is that everything you do, you have to think of the other person as well, if it's going to affect someone else other than you. Just about everything you do will affect someone else as well. And when you're talking about society in general. So, at least put forth the effort to try to be a person who cares for others and not just yourself. If you only care about yourself, just because others have done wrong to you doesn't mean you have to do wrong. What's that old saying? Two wrongs don't make it right?
That's what they said.
So, hey, just wanted to pass that on.
And because our world is filled with narcissistic people, it doesn't mean you have to be one of them.
Exactly. So, think about it and come back. We'll be glad if you have been helped in any form or way. And as time progresses, we'll deal more with the 7 losses.